Hello world, happy Easter! Let's talk about being transgender and Christian. Oh my gosh, welcome to the Easter season. Did you know that the Easter season is not just one day in the church calendar? Easter actually lasts for 50 whole days. That's 10 days more than Lent, for those of you that are counting. During this season of the church year, we read through the ends of the four Gospels, reading about what happens to Jesus between the resurrection and his ascension into heaven. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Some of us were able to go to an inclusive and welcoming church this Easter to experience an Easter service, but many of us weren't able to find that and don't have a church home that is welcoming and accepting of them. So, in case you haven't heard it yet, Christ is risen. Death has not gotten the last word in Jesus' story. Despite the fact that Jesus was betrayed by his friends and tortured and unjustly killed, God was able to bring life out of that worst case scenario. The Apostle Paul says that because God brought Jesus through death and back to life, that means that death has now been defeated. Which of course doesn't mean that death doesn't exist anymore, but what it means is that the story doesn't end with death. Jesus' story doesn't end with death, and our story won't either. Injustice will not stand forever, and love cannot be kept in a grave. Lent this year was a particularly difficult time for trans folks, whether they're religious or not, because in the last few months we've seen legislation crop up that basically tries to legislate us out of existence, and we've seen the first deaths of our trans and our gender nonconforming siblings in 2016. I'll be honest with you and tell you that this Easter I was sitting in church for the Easter service and thinking, I can feel the truth of this story, but I don't know how to go back to work on Monday and face the fact that people are still dying and that hate is spreading faster than ever. How do I go back when it feels like nothing has changed? And I think that's the question that a lot of people are stuck with after Easter, this sense of what's changed? We might be helped by realizing that this is probably the same questions the disciples were asking on Easter morning. The Gospels tell the story of how Mary Magdalene and the other women found the tomb empty and how they interacted with the angels who told them that Jesus was risen, and they quickly ran and went to tell the male disciples of Jesus. The conversation between Mary and the men is recorded differently in each Gospel, but my favorite one comes from Luke chapter 24. This chapter tells us that the women rush up to the men and Mary starts telling them what's going on, and she's so excited, and the men kind of don't go for it. Verse 11 says, "Their words seemed to the disciples to be an idle tale." Now, if you're going to translate the Greek there, not literally word for word, but literally in terms of the meaning, it's probably better to say the disciples thought this was bullshit. They were not having it. The disciples were so caught up in their grief about what had happened to Jesus that they were sure that nothing could possibly have changed. So, skip about 8 hours later in the day to John chapter 20. The men are all gathered in this upper room and they're working through their grief and their disbelief that the person that they thought was God could possibly have been killed by the Roman Empire, and they've got the doors locked because they're afraid somebody might try to come kill them too. And then, all of a sudden, Jesus is standing there in the room with them. Did he come through the door all shimmery, or did he just poof into being? How did he get there? Well, we don't know. But what we do know is that the disciples were all scared stiff because the first thing Jesus says to them is, "Peace be with you," or in other words, chill out. Then, to prove he's not a ghost, Jesus shows the disciples the nail marks in his hands and in his feet, and the place where he was pierced in his side. And it's only then, after seeing those wounds, that we're told that the disciples begin to rejoice and begin to have some hope again. It's only when they see Jesus' body, which has not changed. Many theologians over the years have tried to explain why Jesus' body still had all of the same wounds after the resurrection. Why wouldn't God have just risen him up with a healed, better, shiny new body? Thomas Aquinas, who was one of the church fathers, had a whole bunch of reasons why he thought Jesus might have kept his wounds. Maybe it was to prove something to the disciples, or to have sort of a trophy of a victory over death, or even to guilt people into believing, hey, look what I did for you, you gotta believe now. Personally, the theory that resonates most with me is that, as Broderick Greer said in his sermon this Easter, God respects our suffering too much to forget it. For Jesus, who was just as much human as he was God, it would have been dishonest to pretend like the suffering that he experienced for us and with us had never happened. By keeping his wounds, Jesus says to the disciples and to us, I have been there. I have felt this. I have been to the deepest, darkest, most terrible place. I have suffered, and I have not forgotten, and I will not leave you there. So maybe the question for us this year is not what's changed, because we're reminded of what's changed whenever we read the gospel story and remember that love and hope are everlasting, while grief and sorrow and suffering are temporary. Instead, maybe we should be asking what hasn't changed. What didn't change for Jesus after his resurrection was his solidarity with humanity. He could have gone right back up to heaven after his death, but instead he came back and he showed his wounds and his new life to his friends. What didn't change for Jesus was his commitment to peace. He could have risen up from the tomb with a sword and gone enacting vengeance on the people who had killed him, but instead, he went and met with the people who he loved and who loved him, and he told them, "Peace be with you." What hasn't changed for us this Easter is that all of these promises, all of these pieces of Jesus, all of these things are not just for the disciples, but they are for us too. Jesus kept his wounds to remind us that our suffering matters to him. But God broke the rules and brought Jesus back to life to remind us that suffering is not the end. For Easter this year, nothing has changed and everything has changed. Thanks for watching the video this week, everybody. I hope you had a great Easter, but even if you didn't, we still have about 50 days of resurrection left, so it's going to be okay. I will see you back here next Wednesday, everybody. Peace.